Welcome back to the deep dive. We are doing something a little different today. Usually we take a broad topic and narrow it down, but today we're taking a subject that feels, well, infinitely broad, microbiology, and trying to give it a shape that actually makes sense.
It's a necessary shift. I think most students spend the first part of their micro course just feeling like they're memorizing a phone book.
Oh, absolutely.
You know the drill, right? Memorize the organism, the gram stain, the shape, the oxygen needs. It's all just bugs in isolation.
Right. It's miserable. But today we are flipping the script. We're looking at Chapter 33 from Lippincott Illustrated Reviews, Microbiology. The title is just Disease Summaries, which sounds a bit dry.
But it's not. The concept is really the holy grail for students. It shifts the focus from here is the bug to here is the patient.
It's the bridge to clinical practice.
Exactly. Patients don't walk in saying, I think I have a gram-negative rod. They come in with a cough or a fever or some kind of rash. This chapter organizes all that chaos into clinical syndromes.
So we're looking at it system by system.
Right. We're asking, based on where the infection is and how it's presenting, what's the most likely culprit?
And to ground this, the text uses CDC data. I was looking at figure 33.1, and it's a bit of a wake-up call about what's actually common in the U.S. You see this bar chart, and the top two, they aren't the flu or salmonella.
No, not even close. They're sexually transmitted infections. By a landslide, chlamydia is number 1, gonorrhea is number 2. So, if we're talking high yield,
For exams and for real life.
we have to start there.
Okay, let's unpack those big two then. Chlamydia trachomatis is right at the top of that chart. What makes it stand out besides just the sheer number of cases?
It's the demographic. The text really highlights that chlamydia hits young women the hardest, and it's often called a silent epidemic in that group because, well, it can be asymptomatic.
So you don't even know you have it.
Right, and because it doesn't always show symptoms, it often goes untreated, which can lead to really severe consequences down the road, like pelvic inflammatory disease or even infertility. It's a silent destroyer.
And then number 2, gonorrhea. I feel like we hear more about this one in the news, but usually because treatments aren't working.
That is the whole story with gonorrhea right now. Resistance. The source material is very explicit about the rise of drug-resistant strains. It's becoming a nightmare to treat.
So we're running out of antibiotics that work.
We are. It's a huge public health issue. So, while chlamydia is about volume and silence, gonorrhea is all about the battle against resistance.
Okay, we can't talk bacterial STIs without talking about the great imitator, syphilis. It always seems to take up so much mental bandwidth for students.
Because it's a saga. It's not a single event. Treponema pallidum, it plays the long game. The text breaks it down into 3 acts, and you absolutely have to know the progression.
So walk us through Act 1, primary syphilis.
Primary is the chancre. This shows up about 2 to 10 weeks after you're exposed. The patient gets this hard ulcer, usually on the genitalia. But here's the critical detail you have to remember.
It's painless.
It's painless.
Which sounds like a good thing, but it's actually why it spreads, isn't it?
Exactly. If it doesn't hurt, you might just ignore it. And even if you do nothing, the ulcer heals on its own. But the bacteria haven't gone anywhere. They've just gone deeper.
Which brings us to Act 2.
Secondary syphilis. Now it's systemic. The bacteria are in the blood, so you get a rash, classically on the palms and the soles, and you might even see things like hepatitis or meningitis. The body is screaming that the infection is everywhere.
And if you still miss it.
Then you hit the latent period. It goes quiet, sometimes for years. But eventually you get to Act 3, tertiary syphilis. And this is the really destructive phase. We're not talking about rashes anymore.
What are we talking about?
We're talking about these granulomas called gummas that literally eat into bone and skin. We're talking neurosyphilis, degenerative changes in the brain, and major cardiovascular damage.
Terrifying. And the text also mentions it can cross the placenta.
Yes, congenital syphilis. It's a tragedy because it is so preventable. If a pregnant woman has active syphilis, it can cross to the fetus and cause spontaneous abortion or severe birth defects. Screening is just vital.
While we're on ulcers, I want to clarify something. You said the syphilis ulcer is painless, but the book mentions another bug, Haemophilus ducreyi, that causes chancroid.
This is a classic board question. High-yield comparison. If you have a patient with a genital ulcer, the first clue is the pain level.
Okay.
If the ulcer is ragged and it's painful, you think Haemophilus ducreyi. If it's clean, hard, and painless, you think syphilis. Painful versus painless. That's the fork in the road.
Got it. Okay, that's the bacteria. But the reproductive tract also hosts protozoa and viruses. The text flags Trichomonas vaginalis as the most common protozoal one.
It is. And the biology here is all about the environment. Trichomonas, it's a bit of a Goldilocks organism. It really struggles in a healthy acidic vagina, which has a pH around 4.0. Trichomonas needs a pH around 6.0 to really thrive.
So an infection actually requires a change in the host's chemistry.
Or it just exploits a shift. When that pH rises, Trichomonas takes off, and you get that classic frothy, yellowish discharge. It's a great reminder that the vaginal microbiome is a real defense system.
Then we have the viruses. Herpes and HPV. I feel like people often conflate the risks here.
They're very different threats. HSV2, herpes simplex type 2, is mainly about managing the symptoms. It causes those painful vesicles, the blisters. The biggest immediate danger is to newborns. Neonatal herpes has a very high mortality rate.
Whereas HPV, human papillomavirus, is less about the immediate pain and more about the long-term consequences.
Exactly. You have to put HPV into two buckets. You have the strains that cause condylomata acuminata genital warts, unpleasant but benign. And then you have the oncogenic strains.
The cancer-causing ones.
Right. They don't just cause bumps, they can actually rewrite cellular DNA to cause cancer. Cervical, penile, rectal. That's why the vaccine is such a monumental achievement. It's basically a cancer vaccine.
Let's shift gears. We're moving from the reproductive system to the gut. Foodborne illness.
The fecal oral route, as the text politely puts it, it's a huge category. The key is to think about the mechanism. Is the bug invading the gut wall, or is it just sitting there making a toxin? That's what determines the symptoms.
Okay, so let's take invasion first. The patient has dysentery blood and mucus in the stool.
That screams Shigella. It causes shigellosis. This bacteria isn't happy just floating in the gut. It invades and destroys the mucosa of the large intestine. That destruction is why you see blood.
Okay, then there's E. coli. This one is always confusing because E. coli is supposed to be normal, right?
Right, but not all E. coli are created equal. Figure 33.3 in the text helps here. You can basically think of the traveler and the killer. E-tech and teratoxigenic E. coli, that's traveler's diarrhea. It makes a toxin that causes watery diarrhea, but it doesn't actually destroy the tissue.
As opposed to the one we see in recalls for, like ground beef.
EHC, enterohemorrhagic E. coli, especially the O157 serotype. This one makes a Shiga-like toxin. It causes bloody diarrhea, but unlike Shigella, it doesn't invade. It just obliterates the microvilli from the outside with this incredibly potent toxin.
And if we're just talking about pure volume of fluid loss.
It has to be Vibrio cholerae. Cholera. It produces these rice water stools. The toxin basically turns on a faucet in your gut, dumping water and electrolytes so fast a patient can go into hypovolemic shock in hours.
Wow. So antibiotics are the immediate answer for all of these.
Counterintuitively, no. The text really emphasizes that for most of these, especially cholera, the absolute priority is fluid and electrolyte replacement. Keep the patient hydrated, and the immune system can usually clear the bug.
Let's stay in the pelvis, but move over to the urinary tract. UTIs. The text makes a point that anatomy is destiny here.
It really is. UTIs are way more common in women. It's just simple geometry. The female urethra is shorter and closer to the anus. It's a much shorter commute for bacteria to get from the GI tract to the bladder.
And looking at figure 33.4, there's one organism that just dominates this commute.
It's E. coli again. It is the undisputed king of UTIs, causing something like 70 to 95% of uncomplicated cystitis. It just climbs up, latches onto the bladder wall, and causes that classic painful urination.
But the text does mention a distant second.
Staphylococcus saprophyticus. It causes maybe 5 to 20% of cases, but the demographic is so specific, it's almost exclusively found in sexually active young women. So if you have that patient profile and the culture isn't growing E. coli, this is your prime suspect.
And the real danger with any UTI is that it can ascend.
Right.
It can move up.
Right. Cystitis is an infection of the bladder. It's uncomfortable, but it's manageable. If those bacteria keep climbing up the ureters to the kidneys, that's pyelonephritis. Now you're talking fever, flank pain, a systemic infection. The stakes get much, much higher.
Speaking of high stakes, let's move to section 3, meningitis. The text basically stops being polite here and just calls it a medical emergency.
Because it is. Bacterial meningitis kills. We're talking about an infection of the meninges, the membranes that wrap the brain and spinal cord. If you don't treat it, it's almost 100% fatal.
So what's the clinical triad we're looking for? Figures 10.3.5 lays this out.
Fever, neck stiffness, and altered mental status. If you see those three together, you have to move fast. Very fast.
And when you do the spinal tap, what story is the fluid telling you?
You're looking for three things in the CSF. A high white blood cell count, high protein, and this is the absolute key low glucose.
Why is the glucose low?
Because the bacteria are hungry. They are literally eating the glucose in the cerebrospinal fluid for fuel. Viruses don't really do that. So if the glucose is normal, you might think viral. If the glucose is bottomed out, it's bacterial.
The text has a very specific warning about treatment here.
This is a do not fail point for any student. Do not delay antibiotics to get a CT scan. If you even suspect bacterial meningitis, you start empiric antibiotics immediately, and you add a steroid, dexamethasone, to stop the inflammation from damaging the brain. Time is brain.
Okay, let's drop down to the liver. Hepatitis. We have the ABCs. Is there an easy way to keep the transmission routes straight from figure 33.6?
Absolutely. Think vowels and consonants. Hepatitis A is a vowel. It affects the anus. It's fecal-oral transmission, so contaminated food or water. It's acute. You get sick, you clear it, and then you have immunity. No chronic state.
And B and C, the consonants.
Transmitted by blood and body fluids. Hepatitis B is sexual or from mother to child. It can become chronic. Hepatitis C is the chronic one. Primarily blood transmission, so think IV drug use. It's the leading cause for liver transplants because it just quietly destroys the liver over decades.
But there is a little bit of a silver lining in the text for Hep C.
A huge one. It used to be a life sentence. Now we have these direct-acting antivirals that can actually cure the infection. It's a massive breakthrough.
Let's take a breath and look at the lungs. Pneumonia. The text splits this into typical and atypical. That language is always a little confusing.
It is. Atypical doesn't mean it's rare. It refers to the presentation. Typical pneumonia is like the movie version. Sudden onset, shaking chills, you're coughing up thick sputum. That's usually strep pneumo.
And atypical is sneaky.
Exactly. It's insidious. The patient has this dry, hacking cough, maybe a low fever. They don't seem that sick.
But the X-ray tells a different story.
Right. The classic line is, the X-ray looks worse than the patient. You see these diffuse, patchy infiltrates, but the patient is walking around. That's why they call it walking pneumonia.
And who are the culprits there?
Mycoplasma pneumonia is the most common, especially in crowded places like dorms. But you also have Legionella.
Legionnaire's disease.
Right. That one's associated with water aerosols, like air conditioning systems, and it's more severe than the other atypicals. It really hits smokers and the elderly much harder.
So if a patient walks in, can you tell the difference right away?
Not always. And that's why outpatient treatment is usually empiric. You use drugs like macrolides or doxycycline because they cover both bases. They hit the cell walls of the typical bugs and the intracellular machinery of the atypicals.
We are in the home stretch now. Let's look at a smaller target, the eye.
The eye is a really unique environment. The text highlights trachoma, which is caused by specific serotypes of chlamydia. It's the leading cause of infectious blindness in the world.
How does an infection actually lead to blindness?
It's mechanical. The chronic inflammation causes scarring on the inner eyelid, and eventually that scarring forces the eyelid to turn inward. It's called entropion.
So the eyelashes are scratching the cornea.
Every single time the patient blinks, it just grinds away at the cornea until it's opaque. It's a horrific mechanism.
And this connects back to birth, too.
It does. Ophthalmia neonatorum. If a baby is born through a birth canal infected with gonorrhea or chlamydia, they can get severe conjunctivitis. Gonorrhea is the scary one. It's hyperacute and can blind an infant in days. That's why every single newborn gets antibiotic ointment in their eyes.
And just quickly, the most common eye issue.
The common stye. That's usually Staph aureus infecting an eyelid gland. Simple warm compresses are the fix for that.
For our final section, we have to talk about what happens when all the defenses fall. The text has a whole section on opportunistic infections in HIV.
This is the concept of the immunological dam. We're surrounded by microbes that a healthy immune system just laughs off. But when HIV takes out your CD4 plus T cells, that dam breaks.
So let's run through the floodwaters. Figure 33.9 lists the major ones.
Okay, start with bacteria. You have Mycobacterium avium complex. It's in soil, it's in water, it's everywhere. To us, nothing. To an AIDS patient, a disseminated fever and wasting disease, and of course a huge resurgence of tuberculosis.
Then the fungi get their shot?
Pneumocystis jirovecii is the big one. It causes PJP pneumonia. Before the AIDS epidemic, this was an incredibly rare disease. In untreated AIDS, it was a primary cause of death. Then you have Cryptococcus, a yeast from bird droppings. In a compromised host, it goes to the brain and causes meningitis.
And finally, the parasites.
Toxoplasma gondii. The definitive host is the house cat. Most of us have been exposed, and our immune system just walls it off. But in an AIDS patient, it reactivates and attacks the brain, causing these ring-enhancing lesions and seizures.
It's a really sobering list.
It is. And that actually leads to the provocative thought I wanted to leave you with.
Wait, yes.
When you look at this whole chapter, chlamydia scarring the eyes, toxoplasma waiting in the brain, staph just sitting on our skin, you realize that health is not a passive state. It's not the absence of bugs.
It's an active process.
It's an active, daily cantonment of a microbial world that is constantly trying to eat us. We're always under siege.
The immune system is a riot shield.
Precisely. And when that shield drops, the opportunists rush in.
On that note, let's recap where we've been. We covered the silent spread of STIs, distinguished the pain of chancroid from the painless chancre of syphilis, and navigated the alphabet of hepatitis.
We walked through the gut, distinguishing invasive Shigella from toxin-producing cholera. And we clarified why E. coli is the absolute king of UTIs. And finally, we saw how opportunistic infections really define the progression of AIDS.
It's a lot of material, but if you can hang your hat on the syndromes, what the patient feels, not just what the bug looks like, it sticks. That's it for this deep dive into Lippincott's Chapter 33. Good luck with your studies.
See you next time.
Take care, everyone.